But first, that explosion at a nuclear plant in the Soviet Union. What caused it and how many people did it hurt? Scanty information has come so far from the Soviets, but here's Peter Snow to help fill out the gaps.
It does now seem likely that sometime in the last couple of days there's been perhaps the worst accident in the short history of the world's nuclear power industry. The Russians may have been hoping they could contain it without having to release the news, as they appear to have tried to do so in an earlier accident in the Urals 19 years ago. But the fact that they've had to reveal it and admit that there are casualties suggests they're deeply worried about the scale of it. The first scientific judgments outside Russia is that there's no danger to life in Scandinavia, where the contamination was first picked up, and in Britain, the National Radiological Protection Board say the levels are so low that if it ever reached Britain, it should not cause any harm. Well, it was just 4 hours ago when Soviet viewers were watching their evening news bulletin and the announcer revealed that the accident had taken place. The official news agency TASS later added that aid was being given to those affected. The accident was at Chernobyl, a town of around 50,000 people, about 50 miles due north of Kiev in Ukraine, and around 300 miles southwest of Moscow. The city of Kiev alone has a population of some 1.5 million people. There is no news tonight of any evacuation, although TASS did say that measures were being taken, and I quote, to eliminate the consequences of the accident. The first sign of an accident came in Sweden, not in Russia, when a sudden rise in radiation levels set off alarms from the Forsmark nuclear plant. Workers were evacuated, the plant was shut down, but no leak was found there. When reports began coming in from other parts of Scandinavia of increased levels of radioactivity, Sweden began to suspect that the leak had occurred in the Soviet Union. Norway recorded only slightly higher levels, but in Denmark, radioactivity was detected 5 times greater than usual, similar to the readings in Sweden. But the highest levels, up to 10 times more than normal, occurred in Finland. The Swedish authorities say there is no danger to life there, despite the sudden increases in radioactivity. But it may give some indication just how big the leak was, that the nearest point of the Swedish coast is 700 miles from the site of the disaster in the Ukraine. Well, now, what's caused it, the Russians aren't saying. But at Chernobyl, they have 4 working reactors of 2 different types. And it appears from the likely scale of this accident that the one that went wrong was probably a pressurized water reactor. The central part of the pressurized water reactor is the reactor vessel, a huge cylinder of welded steel, about the size of a large room, but 3 stories high. Now, inside this reactor vessel, right in the center of the picture there, cooled by water under heavy pressure, is the reactor core, a bunch of metal tubes packed with the highly radioactive uranium oxide, whose intense heat is removed by the circulating water to the steam generator, which in turn powers the turbines that generate electricity. What may have happened is a rupture in that very hot, high-pressure water circuit. The water may have leaked out enough to uncover the rods in the reactor vessel, which might then melt due to their own intense heat, releasing radioactivity into the water and steam and out through the leak into the atmosphere. Now, this is just what might have happened at the 3 Mile Island power plant in Pennsylvania 7 years ago when a valve stuck open there, except that there, in Pennsylvania, the reactor was enclosed in a massive concrete containment building, and this trapped almost all the radioactivity. We don't know for certain whether the Chernobyl reactor had a containment building. Some Soviet reactors do not have them. Now, since the advent of nuclear power about 30 years ago, there's been a series of leaks and accidents. 3 Mile Island in 1979 in Pennsylvania was America's worst. A breakdown in the cooling system caused the partial meltdown there. 4 years earlier, at Browns Ferry in Alabama, a fire put out the plant's control room. Britain's worst accident was in 1957 when fire destroyed the core of a plutonium-producing reactor at Windscale. Clouds of radioactivity were released and 2 million litres of milk were contaminated. In 1974, now we have, I've just been speaking to Brian Hanrahan on the phone to Moscow.
After this radiation was emerging, did run into, I think that's the only way of putting it, an official from the Foreign Office at a reception this evening and said to him, I'm making an official request. My government would like to know what's going on. And that was an official request, and it went in. He has yet, as I'm talking at the moment, to receive a reply. He, like everybody else, is getting his information from the wires. So there's no indication of what the official response is. There is obviously a lot of response in the embassies where people are trying to keep up with what's going on.
How important, Brian, to Soviet nuclear power capacity is the loss of this reactor, do you think?
Well, the indications are that this is one of a particular sort of reactor which makes up about half of the 30 reactors which are estimated to be in operation in the Soviet Union at the moment. So if that particular design is suspect, it means that that particular group have got to be looked at generally, and this is the time when they are planning to expand their capacity in nuclear power, and they need it quite badly for the new industrial push that Mr. Gorbachev is anxious for. In the short term, I would have thought the more immediate problem is that they have most of these plants grouped in one area or in one half of the country over in the European side of the Soviet Union, which is short of natural power resources. And this complex has not only 4 working reactors, one of which we know has been damaged, but also has 2 which are under construction. So if that is the case, it means if all these things are going on, if there is damage to one of them, if it is a problem, if it has affected the others, if they can't use the others, that means they have lost 4 working reactors and 2 new ones at a stroke, which would mean that area is going to be short of electricity.
Brian Hanrahan, thank you very much indeed. Well, now, what's thought to have been the worst Soviet nuclear incident happened almost 30 years ago near the town of Kishtim in the Urals. The Russians never explained what happened, but Western experts believe it was an explosion of nuclear waste. Pictures taken recently from an American satellite flying high above the Soviet Union show the area of the devastation, right in the middle of the picture there, labelled devastated area, to be very large and still quite evident. Now, the man who first revealed that this accident had taken place was Zhores Medvedev, who's just even more recently written a biography of the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and he's with me now. Zhores Medvedev, what happened in the Urals, and do you think this is as bad as that?
In Urals, the accident was actually the explosion of nuclear disposal site from military reactors. For many years, the Soviet military reactors used to dispose nuclear waste into the one place, supposed to be lake, which later dried out, and finally accumulation of heat and some other chemical processes made chemical explosion, which brought all this nuclear waste material into the air and covered by the cloud very large area not far from Chelyabinsk.
How many people do you think died in that disaster?
From what is known about the population in this area, at least 32 villages had been destroyed or evacuated and not inhabited anymore. So approximately 10,000–12,000 people who lived there did get radiation.
Now, that disaster was not revealed by the Soviet government. This one has been. What does that tell you?
First of all, this one happened in a very densely populated area, while Ural disaster happened in a very sparsely populated area, very far from central population centers of European part of the Soviet Union. So it's impossible to conceal this accident. So a lot of people in Ukraine and in Kiev apparently know about this. So it's impossible to keep it covered up.
Walter Patterson is one of leading experts on nuclear generation. Mr. Patterson, what, first of all, do you think happened this time in Chernobyl?
Well, if the reactor was a pressurized water reactor of Soviet design, any kind of major break in the primary circuit would have allowed the water in the reactor to flash to steam, the cooling to become ineffective, possibly some of the core to become uncovered, in which case there then might have been fuel melting, fuel damage of some kind, which would release radioactivity into the surroundings. If, as seems to be the case, there was no containment around the reactor, as is the general...
Can we be sure of that? What do you think, George Medvedev? Do you think there was a containment building?
I don't think that there is containment building, because the policy of Soviet atomic constructors was that reactors are absolutely safe, and so there is no need to have this kind of precaution, because it indicates possibility of disaster, which Russian always considered absolutely impossible.
So can we be clear about this? You're going as far as to say you think it almost certain or just probable that
I
there was
think it's-
no protective shield around this reactor which appears to have melted down?
No, I think that there is no protection shield around this reactor. It's certainly the case because the building as such indicates that there is no shield.
Now, Walter Patterson, if that is so, what is the danger to life if what you believe happened in the immediate area and beyond?
Well, obviously, if radioactivity got as far as Scandinavia, however long it took to get there, a great deal must have escaped close to the site. It depends, of course, on local weather conditions and on how severe the damage to the plant itself was, but there must have been some considerable amount of radioactivity dumped into the surrounding area, to the town of Chernobyl itself, which I gather has a population of maybe 50,000 people. It seems as though it may have been fortunate that the prevailing wind appears to have been in the northerly direction, northbound, rather than to the south in the direction of Kiev. I don't know what the meteorological conditions were at the time. But
would there be any danger, for example, to places like Moscow, 300 miles away to the northeast?
I think that the danger begins to get very much less serious there. But the corollary is that it is not only an immediate danger to the people who are there when the radioactive plume passes over, but that plume may deposit radioactivity on the ground, which will then continue to be a hazard for the people who stay in the area. This may present the Soviet authorities with a massive evacuation problem.
Zhores Medvedev, would you guess that they are now evacuating at least the people of that town itself?
Yes, I'm quite certain, because if there are casualties, as they admit, from radiation, people are not killed immediately unless it's very major, actually, disaster. So if there are casualties just now and admitted, it means that thousands of more people had got radiation from isotopes and radioactive materials and must be evacuated very quickly. So this is a case with radiation. If radiation does kill few people, this means that thousands of people were affected.
What, in much broader terms and looking much further ahead, what sort of danger do you think there is to people, or might be to people, way beyond the immediate area? I'm talking about now in Poland, across the Baltic, Scandinavia, and even Western Europe.
Well, this plume has obviously traveled a good long distance, and it must have dropped a good deal of radioactivity under it as it traveled. I think that the danger will have abated rapidly once you get away from the immediate locality of the site, by which I mean a radius of maybe some tens of miles. But it may be, nevertheless, a moderate long-term hazard, depending on what kind of radioactivity it is. We haven't been told yet what kind of radioactivity has been in that cloud.
No.
If it's long-lived radioactivity, it will continue to be a hazard.
Right. Now, what about the effects on the Soviet nuclear power industry of this disaster?
I think it may well turn out to be serious, because the Soviet industry has been in the process of trying to reactivate its nuclear power program after a long period of doldrums, and they have been relying particularly on the design of reactor, which seems to have been involved in this accident, as being the basis for a major new construction program. They will obviously have to think hard as to whether they can continue with such a program, given that this has now become public knowledge in the Soviet Union, and given the immediate local consequences and the national awareness of the problem that's been created.
Dr. Medvedev, briefly, how much of a blow to Mr. Gorbachev and his plans for the Soviet nuclear industry?
Well, the Soviet Union has so-called energy program for the year 2000, which is major long-term program to increase the generation of electricity, and the major source of increasing electricity was considered as nuclear power stations. So it was an attempt to increase nuclear power station capacities at least by a factor of 6.
Finally, and most very important as well, Walter Patterson, could this happen here?
If the reactor which has had the accident in Chernobyl was one of the pressurized water reactors at Chernobyl, even that is not yet certain. But if it was, then that will have an impact on nuclear power programs all over the world, because that is the most popular design of nuclear power reactor. It is the design that the UK government wants to start building in Britain at Sizewell B, followed by perhaps another half a dozen plants of the same type.
But it would have a containment building around it at Sizewell.
It would have a containment building, but the fact remains that if you can have that kind of accident, even the economic consequences can be crippling, to say nothing of the health hazard.
Walter Patterson, Zhores Medvedev, thank you very much for joining us. Olivia.
And if there's any more news on that Soviet nuclear accident, we'll bring it to you during the programme.